Oh, there we go. So I'm Alan Smithies. I'm a senior strategic planner in the London Plan team at the GLA, and myself and my colleague Elliot Kemp, who's on the screen there, will be taking you through the guidance today. So this event forms part of the public consultation on the draft design and characterization guidance, which is made of 4 separate London Plan guidance documents. And this is the first of 2 GLA events and is open to anyone interested in design and characterization. The session, as you've just heard, will be being recorded, and a recording will be made available on the consultation Bang the Table page after this event. And we'll also provide a link to today's presentation, which will be on the Bang the Table webpage as well. I'm going to ask my colleagues that are also on the webinar today to introduce themselves. So first of all, we have Elliot. Elliot, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks, Alan. I'm Elliot Kemp. I work with Alan in the London Plan team, and I lead on the design policies as well as the heritage and environment policies.
Great. And Rob?
Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Rob McNichol, and I manage the London Plan team at the GLA.
And then our chair for the 2 Q&A sessions that we've got is Rohan.
Hi everyone, I'm Rohan Ranawira, and I also work in the London Plan team on housing policy. And yeah, as Alan said, I'll be chairing the Q&A.
Super. I also want to give a big thanks to Jill Lawton and Natalie Wells, who are on the call as well, and have made this session possible. And they're on hand to help with any tech issues if they arise. So in terms of this event, please do give us your feedback and put any questions in the Q&A function, not the chat function, as we go along, and we'll come to those questions at the end of the presentations. There'll be 2 bits where we'll answer your questions, and also just to help us out, if you can write in brackets which LPG your question refers to, that would be really helpful, just because there are 4 LPGs that we're reviewing. Super. Okay, so let's get started. So in terms of what we're going to cover in this event, firstly, my colleague Elliot Kemp will cover the background to this guidance and the policy context. Then I will talk through and review the characterization and growth strategy LPG, the optimizing site capacity LPG, and the small sites design codes LPG. We'll then have a Q&A session where we'll answer any questions on those 3 LPGs. And then Elliot will review the housing design standards LPG, and that will be followed by a further Q&A. Super. So over to you, Elliot.
Thanks, Alan. If you move into the next slide, that would be great. Right. So a bit of background to the guidance we're consulting on at the moment. So the first draft of this guidance was called Good Quality Homes for All Londoners, and we released it for information only in March 2020. And following this, the guidance was consulted on as London Plan guidance between the 13th of October 2020 and the 15th of January 2021. So that's for 13 weeks. And the guidance consisted of 4 modules, which are shown at the top. So module A, B, C, and D. Since this public consultation, the guidance documents have been significantly revised. So the changes are in response to the consultation feedback we got, but also to new national policy and guidance, such as the publication of the National Model Design Code and the changes to the NPPF, as well as responding to changes brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic. So the previous draft guidance was also written in a style that doesn't reflect how our new guidance is done these days, because we've reconsidered how we do our London Plan guidance, and we want to make it as succinct as possible and much clearer. So hopefully that is the case. So we're holding a second public consultation on this guidance to provide another opportunity to get your feedback. We're running the consultation for 6 weeks and it will end on the 27th of March. While much of the content of the guidance actually remains the same, the documents have been slimmed down and we've presented them differently. There's also greater focus on the planning process. So the guidance that was in Module A, as you can see from these sort of arrows at the top here, has been split into 2 documents. So one is now called Characterization and Growth Strategies, London Plan Guidance, and the other is called Optimising Site Capacity, a Design-Led Approach. The case studies module D at the end there will not form part of the guidance now. So the intention with that is that we will have the case studies will become part of an online resource, which can link to different London Plan guidance. They're not just linked to one particular bit of guidance. Thus, we're not publishing them separately in a document. Can you do the next slide, Alan? So the guidance implements a number of London Plan policies, which I'll sort of briefly go through. So the Characterization and Growth Strategies guidance links to the first few policies in the design chapter, as well as in providing guidance on implementing Part A and Part B of the Tall Buildings policy. And it also is quite important for implementing policy HC1, Heritage, Conservation and Growth. Next slide, please. As you can see here, these are the other relevant policies for the remaining bits of guidance, the 3 guidance documents. I think it's worth pointing out that the housing standards guidance primarily links to policy D6, housing quality and standards, but it also links to a lot of other policies in the plan. And these are listed by each other, by each standard in a table format in that document, which I'll get on to in the later presentation. Next slide, please. So this slide helps sort of show how the documents sort of work. So the first 3 of them are quite interrelated. So the characterization guidance that the first document sort of helps explain how to do and how it leads into your growth strategy for boroughs is also quite crucial for identifying the areas that are going to be covered by area-wide design codes for small sites design codes. It's also really important at giving you the sort of context for the site assessment that's needed for setting, working out the optimum site capacity and setting your design parameters for those sites. The housing standards should be used when designing and assessing housing developments at planning application stage. So it's not really aimed at the plan making stage at all. So that's quite different from the other 3 documents. And this document is particularly aimed at designers of residential development. So Alan will now cover the first 3 documents.
Great, thank you so much, Elliot. Okay, so on to Characterization and Growth Strategy, LPG. So firstly, what is characterization and a growth strategy? So this is the process of undertaking a characterization assessment or study and then devising a growth strategy for that area. This process should aim to identify what is special and unique about a particular area and form the basis of how the area might change over time. So it's intended to be carried out, like Elliot said, by a borough or neighbourhood planning group, and is broken down into 3 stages, which I'll go on to in the next slides. One important aspect to mention is that the approach taken in this process should be a digital approach to data collection and mapping. And as a result, this should be much more about, or much less about producing PDFs and much more about web-based maps wherever possible. So stage 1 is the characterization survey and analysis. So this stage involves the collection of information and evidence relating to the borough or neighbourhood's character. This should cover at least the elements listed in Part A of Policy D1 of the London Plan. And the LPG itself includes some guidance for each of these elements. And some of these are included on the images on the bottom of the screen there. And importantly, this process should involve the engagement with local communities, businesses, and other interested parties about the characteristics of their neighbourhood that they find special and unique. So as part of this approach, a borough or neighbourhood's character assessment should follow a typological approach, so type-based approach to characterization, as opposed to a historic review or narrative approach to characterization. So this approach should use the London Historic Characterization Thesaurus, which has been developed by Historic England, to define and map character types. So these character types are the urban typologies within an area that can occur in multiple locations throughout a neighbourhood or borough. I've shown a couple images of these on the bottom of the screen there, and an example map of where these might be located. So an example of a character type is a terrace or a metro line estate or a shopping street, for instance, shown in the images there. And this analysis should be carried out at a scale of several urban blocks. So moving on then, so stage 2 is the character evaluation. So this involves a review and interpretation of the data collected during stage 1, and has 3 main elements to it. Firstly, a character evaluation should analyse how the different elements of character interrelate and overlap to create different character areas. So these character areas, they're different to character types. They're the places in the borough, and their boundaries tend to be based on a locally recognised community or neighbourhood or town centre. So, for example, like Wimbledon Town Centre, for instance. And these character areas will have multiple character types within them. So secondly, this process involves a quality and sensitivity assessment. So this includes evaluating the design quality, social and cultural significance, sensitivity to change, and then the opportunity for growth of an area. And then lastly, this process will involve the setting of a tall building definition. So the whole borough should be covered by one or multiple definitions, and this definition should also not be less than 6 stories or 21 meters to the top of the building, and should be numeric rather than a relative definition. So then stage 3 is where the borough or neighbourhood planning group should identify how and where the area will change over time. And so this involves a series of design, visioning, placemaking exercises to identify the following for each character area. So the first one is areas suitable for different levels of change and growth. The second is area-wide vision, policies, and potentially area-wide design codes for these different areas. And then thirdly, locations where tall buildings may be an appropriate form of development. And I think, fundamental to this process is the involvement of and engagement with local communities. And, at this stage, it's a separate set of engagement than in stage 1, and should be focused on how and where to accommodate that change. So I'll now go into a little bit more detail about these 3 placemaking exercises. So as I've just mentioned, areas should be characterized into one of 3 areas of change. So that's shown on the map there on the left-hand side. So areas of conserve, enhance, transform. And in addition to that, their capacity for growth should be assessed. So this capacity for growth relates to the opportunity for growth criteria that I mentioned earlier, and is influenced by the things like the connectivity, the built form of an area, among other aspects. And important to mention at this stage is that this categorization is intended to be it's a tool rather than a designation. having identified an area's level of change and growth, an area-wide vision should be formulated, and a set of policies or parameters should be defined and determined for each of these character areas. These should set the broad parameters of how an area will change, and how its strategic design intentions and aspirations. I've got a picture on the slide there showing an area that's undergone substantial change, where you can see that the character's been significantly improved, and that's just an example there. And I think in reality, much of this work is already being done or being commenced for different areas within a borough or neighborhood. However, we mention it in this guidance as an important part of this of a growth strategy. So the last bit then I'm going to cover is the identification of locations where tall buildings may be an appropriate form of development. So this should be a sieving exercise broken into 4 steps. These are a sensitivity assessment, alignment with area-wide vision, a suitability scoping exercise, and then lastly to define the maximum heights for areas where tall buildings may be appropriate. And I've shown a few images there on the screen about those processes. And this process as a whole should be based on an assessment of harm, and local authorities are encouraged to set out the harm caused by tall buildings in locations where they are not appropriate. So that is a quick run through of the characterization and growth strategies, LPG. I'm next going to look and review the optimizing site capacity, a design-led approach, LPG. So this LPG outlines and builds on the characterization and growth strategies. You can see there on the bottom right-hand illustration, but this outlines the design-led approach to development in London, which requires the consideration of design options to determine the most appropriate form of development on a site. The document sets out the development should optimize site capacity rather than maximize density, and the process involves setting site-specific design parameters and codes to provide clarity over the future design of sites. So these are high-level strategic parameters that address the form, massing, layout of a future development. And by strategic, we're referring to the most important design considerations rather than kind of more detailed design aspects. And then for residential sites, these parameters can then be used to determine a site's capacity using the indicative site capacity toolkit, which is part of the guidance. And so this toolkit allows users to model the massing of a development using 3D SketchUp models, and then using the capacity calculator, which is an Excel spreadsheet, the indicative site capacity can be worked out. And whilst we use this indicative site capacity toolkit within this guidance, it's worth mentioning that alternative software and modeling can be used, providing it's robust. So the approach set out in this document includes 5 stages shown there on the right-hand side. And at a local plan making stage, this guidance should be used when setting design parameters to establishing the indicative site capacity for site allocations, SCHLAR sites, and also any master plans that are being undertaken. And it's important to mention the iterative nature of this process, where the design of a site might go through several iterations. And I've included on the diagram there on the right-hand side that that process of the fact that it's an iterative rather than a linear process. And Throughout this LPG, we've used an example site, which I've shown on the screen there on the left. And I'll now go through each stage in a bit more detail, and I'll reference that site as we go through them. So stage one is the detailed site analysis for the site in question. Some of this analysis will have been done as part of a borough or neighbourhood's character assessment. However, this site analysis is likely to go into more depth. And the LPG itself reviews what should be in this analysis, and I've shown just a few examples on the screen there. Again, we've used the example site just to illustrate these elements. So moving on to stage two, the next stage is the design vision stage. So this is a placemaking exercise in which the local community should be collaborated and engaged with. And a site's positioning within one of the three categories of change, so the conserve, enhance, transform, should then be taken into account. Moving on, stage three is the drafting of a set of site-based design parameters. So these should be concise, graphical, and simple to understand parameters that focus on the strategic design considerations, as I mentioned earlier. And these parameters can be broken down into 6 categories, shown on the right-hand side of the screen there, which align with those in the National Model Design Code. And I've just included some images on the screen there showing the example site again, where different routes and green infrastructure has been positioned on the site. So once that's been done, a set of draft, once the draft design parameters have been resolved, an indicative site capacity can be worked out for sites that are residential. So as I've mentioned, this could be done using the indicative site capacity toolkit, which uses SketchUp, but it could also involve other software where necessary. And once a design has been resolved using the design parameters in stage 3, the indicative site capacity should be based on these. And it's worth mentioning that, it's only intended that, this is an indicative capacity and should be treated as such. And it's also worth mentioning that the site capacity calculator just takes into account the dwelling size mix, the tenure type, and parking ratio. And this allows the calculator to highlight things like the number of homes lost to car parking, which is hopefully a useful feature. And then in terms of the iterative nature of the process that I've touched on earlier, this may be the stage where a designer may feel it's worth changing or tweaking the design vision or draft parameters if the site could be designed in a better way. An example is whether there's adequate quantum of play space or green space, for example. So then once a final site layout has been determined, a site-based design parameter, the site-based design parameters should be finalized. And when undertaken by a local authority, these will be detailed or should be detailed in local plan documents and part of the site allocation process. And these essentially will become a site's high-level design code, which should be used to assess future planning applications. I've shown an example of these finalized parameters for the example site on the left there. And I've also shown a web-based map of site allocations on the right, which is where it's preferable that this information is displayed and held. Great, so that is just a whistle-stop tour or review of the Optimizing Site Capacity LPG. I'm now going to touch on the Small Site Design Codes LPG before we go into a Q&A. So again, what are small site design codes? Again, this process will feed off the Characterization and Growth Strategies, LPG, and these are area-wide rather than site-specific design codes. Much of this base analysis of these design codes will be carried out or have been carried out as part of a character assessment or study, which I've touched on in the first LPG, and in particular are there the character types which I mentioned earlier. So these character types will form the basis of an area-wide design code, and these have also been referred to as area types in the National Model Design Code. And it's worth mentioning that the documents that I'm speaking about today do very much align with the processes in the National Model Design Code. And it's worth reiterating that the aim of these design codes, small site design codes, is to proactively support well-designed new homes by providing clarity and certainty over the design of small sites. And the process of creating these small site design codes can be broken down into 4 stages, shown there on the right-hand side, which I'll now review in turn. So first, stage 1 is the identification of the design code coverage. A borough or neighborhood's character types should be the basis of this. So these character types, a planning authority may choose to do a design code for some of them, such as terrace or matriland estate character type, for example. And the design codes for each of these character types should then provide guidance on some or all of the following conditions. So street facing, high street conditions, backland conditions, or residential extensions. Again, it might provide some or all of the guidance on those conditions. And authorities are also encouraged to identify any small sites for development within their area. So these are actual, specific sites, and they may include things like residential garages or surface car parks, for example. And these should then be identified and shown on an authority's web-based brownfield register maps, like the one I've shown on the right-hand side there. So stage 2 of this document is the design visioning stage. Here, a coding plan should be created, very similar to that detailed in the National Model Design Code. And I've shown an image there on the screen. So this should show where the design code applies and also any identified small sites, which is that process I've just mentioned. Stage 3 is the preparation of the design code. So following the development of that coding plan, a set of design codes for each character type should be prepared. These should be rules-based and use graphical images to illustrate the key parameters. And I've shown a few examples on the screen there. And then we've got stage 4. So stage 4 is the implementation and review of design codes once they've been defined and set. Authorities should monitor compliance of these design codes and amend these where necessary. And there are several example design codes in the appendix of the document. And I've shown a couple of these on the screen. And I just want to give a shout out to the work that both Tower Hamlets and Haringey have already done on design guidance and coding for small sites. And those are the examples on the screen. Great, so that is a very whistle-stop tour of those 3 LPGs. I think we're going to move over to a Q&A. I can see, I'm going to pass over to Rowan now.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks very much. So we've got about half an hour for Q&A. So we've already got a couple of questions in, but if you could keep putting any questions that come to mind into the Q&A function, I'll pick them up as they come along. So let me read out first one. I'm going to take them in order of the LPG that we've covered. So I'm not going to read out the name, but the first one is about the typologies. And the question is, do they need to be as they are in the guidance, or can they be adopted for the specific areas? And a kind of related question about the area studies is, can we build on existing characterization studies? Elliot, do you want to go for that?
Yes.
Two questions.
Yeah. So the idea is to have a consistent approach to characterization across London, and Historic England have very helpfully provided a thesaurus of terms of types. And this is to avoid the problem that we have currently and happens across the country, where people describe exactly the same thing with a different name, and thus it's very difficult to compare one character study to another. So the idea is that we all start using the same words essentially to describe the same thing. They've got an online resource on their website that we've linked to, so you can integrate that into, this is for boroughs and neighbourhood planning groups, to link into their GIS systems for doing this work, and it makes it very easy also to compare across London, and hopefully in the future we'll have a consistent set of characterization studies that make up the whole of the city. On what the second, I think there's a link to, can we use existing characterization studies?
Yeah.
That absolutely. I mean, a lot of the work that's been done for those will just be very relevant and transferable. Obviously, it needs to be put into the new terminology, but if lots of boroughs have done this work before. They've gone out and looked at their streets and spaces, and so they know what it's essentially just collating it together in a sort of a clear format. I think Rob's got something he wants to add to that.
Thanks, Elliot. Yeah, I was just going to say about Historic England's thesaurus of typologies. I mean, I'll be honest with everybody, I was skeptical of it to start off with. I thought, how can you have this kind of classification for such a varied different typologies across London, particularly when you're sort of also talking about the use of these buildings, as well as the kind of how they look, or the character, the kind of more traditional character aspects of them. But I think I've actually done a really good job on it. I think it really works, and it's a pretty comprehensive analysis. So I think it's actually a really useful resource, and I'd encourage everybody to pick it up and have a look at it, because I think it's actually going to be really helpful for boroughs and for us to have that consistency of language in how we're looking to characterize different areas. That was all I wanted to add.
And just to build on that as well, I mean, in the characterization and growth strategies LPG, we've included, I guess, in the appendices, some of the most common typologies, and just some images of those to just try and help and clarify some of the most common typologies. That was all I wanted to say.
Thanks, Alan. I'm just going to pick up one that's quite a kind of overarching question about guidance in general before we proceed. So there's one question on what is the legal, planning and or hierarchical status of this guidance document. I think, Elliot, you covered that in your slides at the start. Do you want to quickly recap what that is?
Yeah, so this guidance links to the policies and the plan. So it's a range of different policies. So that's a clear sort of planning legal linked to it, and this helps express how we expect them to be implemented and provide a consistent approach to doing that. I don't know if Rob's got anything further to add on.
Yeah, so the London Plan guidance is developed under, I won't go into the technical legalities of it, but it's developed under powers that the mayor has to issue guidance and do other things. It should be taken into consideration as a material consideration in both deciding planning applications and in the way that boroughs develop their local plans. So there's no kind of, it's not set out anywhere in legislation that it has to be, but that's the way it's always been treated. And the planning law does allow for things like London Plan guidance to be taken into account as as material considerations. So it has some weight in decision making, but I would say that as it's London Plan guidance, it's not been through the process that the London Plan has gone through. You know, it's not been through public examination or scrutiny by independent examiners. It does go through extensive consultation, as we're doing now with all of you, but it doesn't have quite the same weight that the local plan or a London plan would have. So, but it should be influencing decisions. It should be influencing boroughs' local plans.
Thanks, Rob. I'm just going to take another question on the characterization and growth SPG, and this one is in relation to engagement. So the question is, why does it only say that we should engage with local communities and not must? And have we thought about not only engagement but co-production?
Shall I come in on that one, Rohan?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so just in terms of should and must, it's quite a sort of, I guess, a bit of a technicality, but in planning terms, we tend to use should rather than must. And I think that reflects the discretionary nature of the English planning system. A hard must would imply that there are kind of very set rules that you have to follow in all circumstances. Whereas with the planning system that we've got in this country, it's much more of a balancing act, a process of figuring out what the right answer is through judgment, and therefore should implies that you should be doing these things, but there may well be some reasons why you can't see that through. So it's kind of a typical language that we use is around should rather than must. I would say though that we are very much encouraging boroughs quite firmly to do real meaningful public engagement on all of this stuff. You'll see that throughout all of the bits of guidance that we've got here, we talk about public engagement. We've introduced various stages at which that should be happening, both in the sort of characterization work and understanding the character of the area, really getting a much more granular level of detail and more diverse level of detail than has perhaps been so in the past. About what people value in their areas, engaging on the work to understand a vision, develop a vision for their different areas, and coming up with the kind of the approaches that can be taken in the local plans as well. So I think there's quite extensive engagement that we're suggesting should be happening. In terms of co-production, I think we don't want to be too dictatorial about exactly how boroughs should be doing this engagement work. Co-production is an incredibly valuable tool for a whole load of different types of engagement, but it might not be suitable for all areas of the borough. It might not be a suitable thing to be doing for all aspects of the local plan, given that it should, if done properly, it's quite a significant amount of resource that's needed. It's a serious piece of work. So, we are asking a lot already in terms of engagement on this, but I think requiring co-production across the board would perhaps be a step too far in terms of what's appropriate for a lot of this work. But it is, that engagement work is something we definitely want boroughs to be picking up and doing in a meaningful and hopefully rewarding way.
Thanks, Rob. I'm just, again, going to pick up a couple of overarching questions that cut across all the LPGs. The first is about the kind of professional resources that boroughs the level of professional resource boroughs will need to undertake them. Will any training be available?
Yeah, I can answer that. So yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes. So we are intending to be running some workshops that will be reviewing and going through some of these processes, particularly to do with drawing up small site design codes, character types, and then also using the SketchUp models and the indicative site capacity toolkit. I think it's also worth mentioning, actually, we we actually have an event on the 16th that UDL are running for specifically for the SketchUp models. So yeah, so it's definitely something that we're looking actively looking at doing, and we've even got one session booked in, but we'll be hoping to do more in the future as well.
Thanks, Alan. And the second kind of overarching question was about the use of mapping throughout all of this. And the question is, why is it preferable? Why have we specified that all the maps are like web-based? And have we thought about who this benefits and who this disadvantages?
I'll have a go at answering it. Maybe Alan can follow up. So the reference to digital is sort of following the government's requirement, the changes to the NPPF, and just good practice. It makes it a lot easier to update and change maps if it's digital compared to sort of paper-based. Obviously, it doesn't stop boroughs having paper-based versions of this to make it as accessible as possible. But there is a big push from sort of central government that everything that in planning becomes much more digital. But with that, Alan, do you have anything further to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, very much echo what you were just saying about, much easier to update. Again, it doesn't mean you can't have paper-based things. It's a case of having being able to just print it off, which is should be relatively straightforward. But yeah, echoing that point that when you're going through these cycles of doing characterization assessment, the aim is that if we go for if this information is held digitally and in data format, then it's much easier to then do a review of a characterization assessment later on down the line, rather than starting from scratch.
Thanks, Alan, and thanks, Elliot. I've had a couple of, I'm going to move on to the next LPG, the Optimizing Site Capacity LPG, and a couple of questions on that. One of them, we had a couple of questions on viability and how do we expect viability feeds into the optimization of sites, and what we are expecting boroughs to do. And there's a kind of broader question about how viability has fed into all 4 LPGs as well. Elliot, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, so we referenced the viability, the need for to assess viability in the in this particular LPG. The point of the design-led approach is to take into consideration the site context, understand what's appropriate for that location. So you're inherently building in viability in terms of the proposal, in terms of deciding what's acceptable, because it will be the appropriate design and respond to the local context for the site. So that builds in an awful lot. When you do the testing using the toolkit, you have a sense of like the amount of housing you'll produce. You can alter the housing mix. That gives you a sense of, okay, well, what is you going to produce? That can help with assess viability. If the site we're talking about is going to become a site allocation, there will be viability testing through the local plan process for the borough. So there will be various different stages of which viability is considered.
Thanks, Elliot. Rob, did you want to come in on that? Or?
Yeah, just to say, obviously, viability is a really complicated issue for the planning system. It's not a straightforward matter, and I think we'd really welcome people's views as to whether there's a need for us to be thinking about the viability process as part of this in any more detail, whether we've got it right, because it is such a bit of a quandary and a bit of a nightmare, particularly for boroughs as they're developing their local plans and the expectation for whole plan viability, which is a significant resource implication for them all. But as Elliot says, I think what we're trying to do with this guidance is, through this design-led approach, through typological approach, characterization assessments, it should help to push even more of those viability questions and discussions upstream, which would help settle them at an earlier stage. It means it embeds it more in the land values, and we think that's something that we've achieved also through the threshold approach of the 35% for affordable housing, but that's a whole other topic, so I won't get into that.
Thanks, Rob. We had a question, I think which was debated a little at the London Plan Examination in Public. It's on the sustainable sustainable residential quality density matrix. So that's not what we're expecting boroughs to use anymore. And the question is, without such benchmarks and instead with this new kind of design-led approach, how are communities of boroughs and developers meant to know what it constitutes over development? Elliot, do you want to go ahead and answer that?
Yes, so we obviously discussed this in quite detail at the examination in public, but now we have the guidance that we sort of promised to produce, and it sets out a systematic approach to considering what is appropriate for the context, its design, understanding it, these sort of stages Alan's went through, and they link obviously to the government design guidance as well. So these are the considerations, and then using that, you have a clear idea of what's acceptable on the site, and then what isn't, and then which would be over development of the site, which is much more nuanced and bespoke to that particular site than the density matrix could allow. And obviously that's why the density matrix, the results of the density matrix was really applied in terms of its numbers, were really followed. So I think it's trying to set out a much clearer approach.
Sorry, can I just build on that? I mean, I guess there are kind of two aspects to that. I guess once the design parameters are set for a particular site, then if a development comes forward with development that's outside those parameters, then that potentially might show that it's overdevelopment, or that it's not complying with that plan-led approach to that particular site. So I guess that would be one indication of that. In terms of when you're actually drawing up those site parameters, within the characterization and growth strategies LPG, we have the areas of change, and so boroughs are going through this process of identifying which areas of the borough are suitable for different levels of change, and at that point, that process will help inform and should help inform those site parameters for particular sites. So for example, the site in a conserve area, we even give a little bit of guidance in terms of what that's likely to mean for those types of areas and development coming forward in those types of areas. If it's not, then that would be an indication that it might need to be revised or so on and so forth. So I just thought I'd add that.
Oh, thanks, Alan. We've got a question about the kind of spatial scale at which site analysis should be conducted. And the question is there a standard for conducting site analysis in terms of spatial scale? Does anyone want to, Elliot?
I think that's a great question, and probably something we should consider putting into the guidance, giving that indication of what scale we're looking at. We give an indication of the scale of detail for the amount for characterization studies to look at, but we haven't set out in this guidance exactly where to draw a line. Its likelihood, it will depend on the characteristics of the site. If it's a small site, it's going to be a much smaller area than a larger site, obviously, and maybe using information from the character study to understand, well, what's the natural, what is the local character area, how wide is that? There might be some natural barriers that would be a reason to sort of go, okay, this is where we sort of draw the limit to what we're looking at. But that's a very useful question.
Thanks, Elliot. I'm just going to do one more on the optimizing site capacity guidance, and then I'll try and pick up a few small sites question. So the final question that I'll cover for now on the optimizing site capacity guidance is, how does infrastructure capacity and requirements feed into the design capacity process? A site with and without infrastructure has very different capacities. Does anyone want to have a stab at that question? Rob or Alan, who wants to go?
I'll let Alan go as he's raised his hand.
Well, maybe you could add on this as well, Rob, but I was just going to mention the kind of opportunity for growth criteria, which we've got in the characterization work, which very much looks at connectivity and how that then informs the opportunity. We use the term growth, and I've seen that there's a few comments about that, and that's a different question. But so the capacity that that connectivity influences and impacts the potential for growth. Rob, do you want to add to that?
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I completely agree with the question. Different sites with different levels of infrastructure, whether that's transport infrastructure, whether it's social infrastructure, schools, hospitals, GP surgeries, green infrastructure, all of that plays into and has to play into the capacity for different sites. It's one of the fundamentals of good planning. So there's a range of, through the characterization work, there's a number of layers of that we're expecting boroughs to collate that sort of information. What is the infrastructure within their local areas that will feed into other work they're doing for their local plans, whether that's understanding their social infrastructure across the area, and it will also be informed by potential for improvements to that social infrastructure or other infrastructure, whether that's improvements to bus links, better walking or cycling, public transport, or where there's challenges with TfL's situation and debates with government at the moment, but that's a bit of another issue. So I think all of that is very much things that we're expecting to feed into the questions of capacity for different sites. So yeah, I mean, I think it's just a pretty fundamental point, but I suppose I would just caution that there's a tendency to think that all of that infrastructure can never be improved, or you just look at what's there now, whereas actually, good planning is about seeking to improve that infrastructure, both for facilitating new development and also for improving the existing areas as well.
Thanks, Rob. I'm going to move us on to the small sites, a couple of small sites questions, because we're going to finish up the Q&A in a couple of minutes. The first question on small sites is, does the requirement to identify small sites only cover existing brownfield sites? And are we going to be encouraging development on garden land and back gardens, or will we get into a position where we're doing that? Does anyone, Elliot, do you want to?
So it's an encouragement in the plan policy H2 small sites, and also in this guidance to for boroughs to identify opportunities, basically small site developments, which they can either, if they wish to, they could allocate them, or that's probably unlikely, but they can identify them in their brownfield register. So it's of identifying that that's not a way to bring forward maybe sort of vacant or underutilized sites through this process. I mean, the thrust of the guidance isn't about allocating sites or identifying; it's about looking at larger areas and thinking about what what type of development could happen on a repeated scale to give you a sort of incremental intensification of the area. So it's a bit that's really the main purpose of the guidance, but it's also it sort of essentially points out that you can identify sites. In terms of back gardens, it's not an active encouragement to build on back gardens, where there might be opportunities for sort of underutilized spaces that might lead into good sort of backland development sites, which are just discussed in the document. That's a possibility. Where any site is developed, a small development, so minor development, comes into play, and it involves any green cover. There's a no net loss of green cover requirement, which is sort of set out in the guidance how you measure that, so ensure we don't lose that green cover in whatever is provided.
Rob, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, can I just add on that? Obviously, as you've heard today, the small site design code work should be informed by the visions that are come up with through characterization assessments. So it's very much a case of boroughs looking to see and working with communities to figure out what the right vision is. So that gives an opportunity for boroughs to say, right, okay, we're going to look at these sorts of sites, whether it's underutilized garages, whether it's development above shops, whether it's in some cases some suitable backland development that does take a bit of back garden space. But that's a process that they should be going through, and as I say, it should be informed by that kind of visioning work. So it's not a kind of us coming in and dictating, you must put them in these areas, you must do this stuff. We're providing a toolkit for boroughs to use to figure out how they can identify those kind of small sites that hopefully will increase increase housing delivery.
Rob, I think you've kind of addressed it just in your answer just now, but there's a question on garage sites and garages potentially having some amenity value. For example, some are like on podiums, underneath podiums that are used for amenity space. The question is, are we undervaluing garage sites that have other values apart from parking?
Yeah, I mean, again, I'd say, it's about that process of visioning, about that process of identifying suitable areas for intensification. I think there are definitely some sites that are underutilized. There may well be some that do play that important role. And of course, there's other requirements where there is, wider estate regeneration schemes that are going on, particularly if they're funded by the mayor. There's various requirements around extensive engagement and consultation through that process. But yeah, I think it's not a case of us saying this is the sort of site that you should be delivering on, but there will be some examples where that's very suitable, and some examples where perhaps there is a wider role for those sites to be at least considering the amenity implications of redeveloping them for housing.
Thanks, Rob. I'm just gonna, in the last couple of minutes we have, I'm just gonna pick up on two overarching questions about the kind of plan making process. So the first question is whether adherence to this guidance from a borough perspective will be a conformity issue when the kind of the draft plans are published and assessed by the GLA. And then the second kind of related question is how does this guidance fit with any existing design guidance at borough levels? Yeah, do you want to have a go at answering that, Rob? Oh, you're on mute. It was going to happen. Always going to happen,
and I'm just pleased it was me, frankly. So, my brain's gone blank. What's it? Remind me the first question.
So, yeah, the first question was about conformity and whether adherence to these LPGs will be a conformity issue.
Yeah. So, for those who don't know, when boroughs develop their local plans, they have to be in general conformity with the London plan, and the mayor scrutinises those local plans and gives an assessment in his view as to whether they are or are not in general conformity and what can be done to make them in general conformity. So it's not a case of us going through every single line of every piece of evidence that every borough produces. That's that would be a bit of overkill in terms of the mayor's role. But certainly we'll be looking to make sure that boroughs have undertaken proper characterization work, and we're also providing quite a lot of support and guidance to boroughs as to how they can do that. So it's not a case of, again, us just saying, you've done it wrong at the end of the process. It's actually much more about us providing support further upstream. I think, already we are providing comments to boroughs around, particularly around tall buildings, as we know the sensitivities around that. We've provided, boroughs and steers to boroughs about making sure that they are looking very carefully at their tall buildings policies, and that that's informed by a proper understanding of the area and doing that kind of work to make sure they're saying, like, this is a suitable area for tall buildings or not, because we know that for that to have real weight in planning decision making, it has to be informed by thorough and extensive evidence work. So we're already engaging with boroughs on that front, and we'll continue that work as this guidance becomes adopted. But I won't say that we'll necessarily be looking to every single line of every piece of guidance or piece of work that the boroughs develop in that conformity work, because there has to be, you know, a degree of this being a sensible and proportionate approach. The second question was around boroughs' own guidance that currently exists. Certainly, you know, if boroughs have developed their own guidance that helps to implement the design and characterization work that we're encouraging, then there's no reason that that can't be continued and sustained. You know, it's often very helpful guidance. And a lot of boroughs will have already done kind of characterization assessments already. We've definitely seen some boroughs that have really led on this and really championed this approach. So where it's relevant, fully endorse and support it. Where boroughs are still, you know, earlier on in that process, then we'd encourage them to pick up this guidance and to have a look at their characterization work and characterization assessments and produce further guidance as is appropriate. Elliot, is there anything you wanted to add on that front? Great.
Okay, thanks for that, Rob. If there's nothing more to add, I think there are a few outstanding questions, but we'll try and pick them up in our second Q&A at the end of the presentation. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Elliot, who's going to present on the Housing Design Standards LPG.
Yeah, thank you. If Alan can get the presentation up, that'd be great.
Hopefully, great. Yeah, hopefully you can see it.
I can see it, thanks. Can you move it to the next slide, please? Great, okay, so I'm going to go through what the sort of housing standard guidance contains. So, I mean, there's been quite a lot of changes to this document, and they're all in response to the consultation feedback we got. So the document has been shortened to focus just on the actual standards. So there's much less supporting text. It's intended to, we've rethought about how we present it. So we intended to use essentially a checklist as it brings together all the policy requirements for housing design development together in one place. It's been restructured to follow the design process more closely. So it considers the wider site first and then moves on gradually into the detail later. It's divided into the 3 sections that are listed on the slide, and I'll go through those briefly in a moment. The guidance more explicitly addresses the climate emergency, and it also addresses the implications of COVID pandemic for spending more time at home. In terms of the structure of the document, there's overall objectives for each section that have been set out at the beginning before the list of standards, so I'll give them a bit of context. And these standards themselves have been put into tables for easier reference, and they also clearly show which policies in the London plan that they link to. The standards are split into those that are required and those that are strongly encouraged and represent best practice. And this document also highlights particularly where standards don't apply to specialist older persons housing. Can you move to the next slide, Anne? Thank you. The guidance is aimed at developers and design teams seeking planning permission and borough development management officers when assessing applications. So it's not aimed at the local plan process at all. It's only for self-contained residential development. So that's use class C3. It's not applicable to other forms of housing, such as shared living, temporary accommodation, student accommodation, etc. Each standard indicates in brackets whether it applies to a new build development, a change of use development, or conversion, or all forms of housing development. So that makes that clear. And the standards express what it means to optimize site capacity for a residential development, as opposed to simply maximizing the development of the site. Next slide, please. So part A, the first of the 3 sections, focuses on the wider area of the site, on placemaking and public realm. So good placemaking involves taking cues from the landscape, topography, the local climate, its heritage assets, pattern of building, streets and open spaces. And the layout of any development will be influenced by a wide range of factors. And the standards cover all the key design considerations that need to take account of. A number of the standards in this particular section address the relationship between building orientation and its massing and thermal efficiency of the building and other implications for achieving net zero carbon. Moving on to the next slide, please. So part B covers the shared and ancillary spaces. So we move into sort of a bit more detail, focus on the site. The majority of new homes over the plan period are going to be flats. Therefore, it's important that the shared indoor and outside space and ancillary facilities are well designed. Careful design can ensure that these shared areas are pleasant, inclusive, sociable extensions of the home that help build supportive communities. So the standards address the internal circulation, number of dwellings per core, parking spaces for bikes and cars. It cross-links to other guidance such as the fire safety guidance, where that's applicable, and it covers the design of the outside amenity space, waste storage, and the long-term management and maintenance of the development. Next slide, please. So part C covers the design, so that gets into the internal bits of the house, of the home, as well as a private outside space. All homes are required to meet the London Plan space standards, which are then exactly the same as the National Described Space Standards. However, these are absolute minimum and not a target. And so the guidance encourages homes to exceed these standards by at least 5% to improve residential quality and accommodate the changes in working patterns and experiences experienced as a result of the COVID pandemic. The standards recommend more generous private space, again in response to the issues highlighted by the pandemic. Homes should generally have at least 2 habitable rooms, each with a window. Homes are expected to be dual aspect unless there are compelling reasons why that cannot be achieved. In regard to daylight and sunlight, the standards aim to complement the considerations of daylight and sunlight impacts using the BRE guidance, which is called Site Layout Planning for Daylight and Sunlight. And this section also covers the design of outside space, making sure it's functional and well designed. So that's a sort of canter through what this document covers. I'm going to pass over to Alan for the final few slides.
Great, thanks so much, Elliot. Yes, so as it says on the screen, public consultation is now live for these 4 documents. We'll come to a Q&A for the housing design standards in just a moment, but I just thought I'd, just before we do that, just run through just a couple of things. So in terms of seeking your feedback, this public consultation is a significant opportunity for us to seek your feedback on the 4 LPGs, and we really will welcome and encourage you to feedback your thoughts on the 4 documents, and the best way to do that is to provide us feedback via the online consultation survey, which I provided a link to on this slide here. And I don't think I need to mention again, but the consultation is open till the 27th of March, and although these are separate guidance documents, you can complete all the different surveys at the same online webpage, all part of the same consultation. Great, so that is everything. I think I will hand back over. Well, first of all, just say a thank you. I've included an email there if you've got any further questions or comments, although we do strongly encourage you to write any feedback to the surveys, not that email. But I'll now hand over to Rohan, who'll chair the next Q&A.
Thanks, Alan. I think there's still questions. There haven't been any questions coming through on the housing design standards yet, but we'll give it a minute for people to put those questions in the Q&A. But I might deal with one of the kind of overarching questions that was asked in the previous Q&A, and that is, how are the LPGs actively supporting the London Plan's housing targets? And this question is kind of in reference to a concern that the LPGs could dampen delivery, maybe with requiring certain things or requiring a certain level of Elliot, do you want to go?
Sure, thanks. So the sort of purpose of them is like, and a lot of the purpose of the policies in the plan is about sort of front loading decisions about where growth happens, and where, particularly if we're talking about housing, where housing will be delivered and can be delivered, and what it should look like. So it's setting out a process where boroughs can identify where growth will happen and weigh up where best to place different levels of growth. But they take that decision is all in the context of the housing targets in the London Plan and their other targets, their growth targets. So it's almost front loading that, making sure that delivery will come through, and planning where it's best to happen.
Thanks, Elliot.
So we've Rob, do you want to come in on that question?
Yeah, just to build on what Elliot said, I think obviously one of the really good ways of helping development to occur is by doing that kind of front loading of the work, and it helps to, particularly when there's been meaningful and thorough engagement with local communities, to inform the characterization work, to inform visions for areas and visions for specific sites. We're hopeful that that will help to facilitate the development that's going to come forward, rather than it being a case of, okay, here comes a scheme that nobody's expected, plonked on this site that nobody's heard of until now. So while I think it is really important for us to realise those housing targets that we've got in the plan, to do that through a design-led approach, we think that doing all of that earlier in the process should smooth the process, but also should help to actually facilitate that housing coming forward.
Thanks, Rob. We've started to have a couple of questions through on the housing design standards, so I'm going to take a few of them. The first question is, will the housing design standards carry weight for potential appeals on proposals? Kind of a question about the technicality.
Shall I come in on that one, Rohan?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so I mean, the housing design standards, I think this just relates to what I was saying earlier. Housing design standards will be adopted as London Plan guidance. That has some weight. It should be a material consideration when it's taken into account on planning applications and on planning appeals as well. Of course, the amount of weight to give to different aspects of guidance or other material considerations is very much a judgment for the decision maker who's making that decision at that time. So there may be other things that the inspector gives weight to, but certainly this would be something that I would normally expect an inspector to be taking into the mix and considering as part of the mix of making that decision.
And I guess one other thing just to add to that, a lot of these standards build on policies that are within the London Plan. So again, it would not only be building on taking the standard into account, but also those relevant policies.
That's a really good point, Alan.
Thanks, Alan and Rob. On a related question of the applicability of the housing design standards, there's a question kind of acknowledging that some of these housing design standards and indeed London Plan policies on design should be applied to existing buildings, and the question is there any intention with the guidance in the case of estate redevelopment schemes to ensure that existing residents can benefit from the new standards?
Yeah, shall I come in there? So yeah, I mean, I think we would expect the standards to be applied quite broadly. So whenever you've got a scheme coming forward that is involving redevelopment of a site, then housing standards are things we would expect people to take into account. Now, I can envisage a potential scenario, whether it's an estate regeneration scheme or other scenario where you've got an existing residential site, changes are being made to that site, and it might be quite difficult for technical reasons to say dramatically increase the size of units or to put additional balconies on where there aren't ones in an existing building. So I think we certainly encourage people to take it into account, and decision makers should be doing that. But there may be some scenarios where it's just technically very difficult to achieve if you're adapting existing buildings rather than creating brand new ones. But other than that, I don't think there's a particular difference between what you might do on an estate regeneration scheme compared to another site that's coming forward.
Thanks.
Just sort of had to link to that. Just in the actual guidance documents, we have sort of these some letters in brackets which indicate whether that particular standard applies to a new build development, a conversion, a change of use, because we acknowledge that, particularly with conversions of maybe an existing house into, say, flats, that it would be difficult sometimes to meet all the standards, and similarly with other forms of development. So that's the aim of that. We welcome your views on whether we've got that right, whether you feel that we've missed some, or that we're applying them in the wrong way. So please respond to that point.
Thanks, Elliot. There's a question on the kind of minimum space standards, and the question is, why have an encouragement to exceed minimum space standards instead of just setting higher space standards? And the concern there is that there's a potential get out of providing extra space. Elliot, do you want to take that?
There's a couple of reasons. So the space standards are set out in the London plan, and we can't change that until we change the plan. But it's sort of a deeper reason is the space standards are actually national standards set by the government. And when they were set, they were very clear that we could not exceed them. They shouldn't be changed. So that's why they sort of repeat the same standards in the London plan as the national described space standards. We recognise that people, how people are using their homes has changed from when those were developed, and we're sort of encouraging people to go further, which is for better practice to provide more space. We identifying the standards of different types of spaces that would be useful, and different ways that more additional floor space can be provided, sort of storage, places for people to study and work, separation of particular uses, so that people can be working at home while other people may be using the kitchen, etc., rather than it all being crammed together, making that difficult to do. So we're trying to, within the limits of what the government will allow us to do, create better quality housing.
Thanks, Elliot. There's a couple of specific questions on specific things that are in the housing design standard. The first one is, do the standards include access to sunlight and daylight? I think yes is the answer to that.
Yes, the answer is yes. So in the standards, we've revised how we approach this sort of area of guidance. We have a number of standards that describe what that cover daylight and sunlight considerations, first at the sort of high level sort of site considerations, and then get that down to the detail. So they're throughout the document, but we also reference the BRE standards, which obviously apply. They're national guidance, and so that assessment would be done in conjunction to our standards.
Alan, do you want to come in on that? Sorry, I wasn't sure what order. But
yeah, I just wanted to build on what Elliot was saying, and also just address a question I can see is in the chat, which says, can you repeat the daylight and sunlight BRE guidance, please? And I think, so one of the reasons why we decided at the moment not to is just because the BRE guidance is very clear that it is guidance, and is, might not be applicable to every single site. And I think for that reason, we've decided not to put it as a standard, because that would indicate that you should do, comply with the BRE guidance no matter what for every single site. And instead we've referenced it as part of the guidance. So we do reference the BRE guidance, but it's just not one of the standards. Rob, do you want to say anything?
Thanks, Alan. Yeah, just to say, I think we recognise there's real sensitivities around daylight and sunlight. You know, we know there was a campaign that was launched when we initially consulted on this guidance. We know that people care very deeply, quite rightly, about the impacts of daylight and sunlight on neighbouring properties, on new build properties, on the surrounding area. It is really important. I think we're really keen not to muddy the waters unnecessarily on this, and I think, you know, by having additional guidance that's repeating or paraphrasing or trying to supersede the national the BRE guidance, we could get into some sticky waters. That's not the right metaphor, but you understand what I'm saying. But we very much welcome people's feedback on this. We really want to make sure we're getting this right, and that people are comfortable and confident with what we're saying on it. So do please keep giving us your feedback and respond to the consultation.
Just to add one sort of practical point on repeating the guidance. So the BRE guidance is quite a long document. It's very technical. There isn't a simple do this and that's it. It's do this, consider that, do this measurement, etc. And so you need to do all of that. So we'd almost need to, well, we'd have to reproduce the whole document, and as it exists, there's no reason to do that. So that's probably just a practical side to not repeating the whole of the BRE guidance.
Thanks, all of you. There's a couple of questions on the impact of the pandemic. So the questions are related to, have we thought about a kind of minimum workspace requirement in the housing design standards, or have we thought about extra provision for outside space in light of what we've seen in terms of people's changing lifestyles with the pandemic? Alan, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I can take that. I mean, first of all, we really welcome your feedback and thoughts and potential ideas for you know, some of this, because COVID has, you know, led to significant changes in sort of how we use our homes. I mean, I guess I'd highlight a couple things that we have already done within the guidance, one of which we've already touched on, which is the exceeding floor area. I mean, we are also saying as best practice that you should be providing a dedicated study as well. And then we're also saying within, I think it's C5.6, standard C5.6, to increase privacy and allow different activities within the house. So again, recognizing that, you know, homes are being used differently than they were. But yeah, just, you know, I definitely reiterate, you know, please do give us your feedback in to these different elements, and yeah.
Thanks, Alan. Yeah, it's definitely an emerging thing that we'll keep an eye on. So yeah, we'll welcome feedback on that. There's an interesting question on it's kind of related to small sites, but also about accessibility. So the question is, a lot of the small sites coming forward under policy H2 are minor developments on hills or sloped sites. Is there any accessibility design guidance that deals with how you might approach that? And the specific context of that is that in Croydon, there's a large volume of small sites planning applications, and it's difficult to argue that all of these are exceptional with regard to M42 compliance. That last bit is a bit specific, but maybe a general comment on dealing with sloped sites and accessibility.
So the housing design standards do provide guidance on sort of accessibility throughout, thinking from the site level down to the sort of detail internal design. So some of that guidance will be applicable depending to that situation. the requirement to provide level access, we don't get into the detail of sort of how, the street level design. We do have existing accessibility guidance, which maybe Rob can comment on whether the plans for that later. But so that may also be of use to you when looking at a particular design.
Yeah, and I just let people know we are looking to review our Accessible London SPG at some point, and I think we'd really welcome people's views on feel free to comment on the kind of accessibility issues in this guidance. We can always sort of take people's views and take that forward as we look to review the accessibility guidance in the future. But yeah, I think we're not looking to provide kind of really specific design guidance in this that's going to say, okay, if you've got this sort of site, then you need to provide this sort of access and resolve things in this sort of way. But yeah, we're happy to have a conversation on that, the specifics on that, because I think it's increasingly something we need to be mindful of and thinking about as we look to develop that accessibility guidance in the future.
Thanks, Rob. And I've got another question on a specific type of site. This one is on build-to-rent sites. The question is on build-to-rent sites. And the question is there any recognition of the differences in design approaches for build-to-rent development? And that's specifically in relation to circulation and the way flats are managed in build-to-rent schemes. Elliot, do you want to take that?
So we don't differentiate between different forms of self-contained housing in this guidance. Essentially, the idea is it's providing good quality homes, however, whether they're rented or whether they're going to be owner-occupied. At any point, the buildings that are built to rent now maybe one day be owner-occupied. So we need to ensure that they're meeting the same requirements and providing decent quality accommodation. So we think that the same issues for internal circulation space or management, the guidance it's going to be the same for different forms of accommodation in terms of what we're providing guidance on. So the short answer is there isn't a different guidance. Thanks,
Elliot. I might try and fit in just one more question before we wrap up, because we're approaching 11:30. I guess the final question we'll take is one on heritage consideration, and the question is, are there any explicit allowances for heritage consideration? I think that's in relation to the housing design standards. Elliot, do you want to?
Yeah, so we do. There's reference to heritage considerations in the housing design standards at the beginning of the standards. But also, if the question is more about an existing historic building, then hopefully whether it's a new build, change of use, or conversion sort of key in our standards might help determine whether a particular standard is relevant for that particular building. So hopefully, but please give us your thoughts and comments about this issue if you're feeling we're not addressing it sufficiently.
Thanks, Elliot. I think there are a couple more outstanding questions, but I don't think we have enough time to cover them, unfortunately. But if you'd like your question to be answered, you can get in touch with us through the email. But of course, if you're making a kind of wider comment, then respond to the consultation as we've set out. I'm just going to hand back to Alan to say a final wrap up or instructions. But thanks everyone for your questions.
Great. No, thanks, Rohan. I mean, to be honest, I don't have too much or anything really to add. Just to thank everyone for joining the call. I hope we've been able to answer at least some of your questions, and just reiterate what we've been saying. Please do let us know your thoughts and feedback through the online consultation survey. We've put some links to it in the chat. But yeah, thank you very much.